For a man who was to become probably the most influential Russian statesman, Joseph Stalin emerged from very humble origins. He was born in 1879 at Gori in Georgia, the son of a shoemaker and a peasant washerwoman. The 10th house is the house of the father. Scorpio is on the cusp of the 10th house, and therefore Mars represents the father. And Mars is in the 4th house, which is the house of the mother. This aspect is therefore descriptive of both parents. That is, Mars in Taurus in the 4th house, ruler of Scorpio on the cusp of the 10th house. Parents were Georgian. Stalin's early experiences of poverty, hardship, and his father's drunken violence no doubt shaped his revolutionary politics and conditioned the hard-hearted treatment of his own family and the Russian people themselves. Mars, the planet of violence, represents the father, and it occurs in the 4th house of early childhood, family, and domestic life. Mars in Taurus in the 4th house. Father beat him as a child. Also in Taurus is Pluto, the planet that rules the feet and footwear. So we can say more about the father. Father was a cobbler. Mars operated in another capacity later in Stalin's life. At the outbreak of the First World War, he was rejected by the Russian army as unfit for military service. Failed tests to join army. He was rejected because of his damaged arm. A childhood accident had caused his left arm to wither and become a burden for the rest of his life. Mars is opposed by Venus and Scorpio in the 10th house. Burdened by injured arm. Notice that Mars is somewhat softened by being conjunct to the most spiritual planet in the horoscope, Neptune retrograde. And this is the mother's influence in the horoscope. Neptune retrograde in the 4th house outweighs Vulcan, ruler of Taurus, on the cusp. Stalin loved his mother always. She was the only person he was ever devoted to. He held a reverence and a sincere admiration for her dedication and hard work. The aspect is Neptune retrograde in Taurus in the 4th house. Spiritual bonding with the mother. She had wanted her son to become a priest and had him sent to a theological seminary in Tbilisi. In the repressive atmosphere of the seminary, Stalin grew politically aware. Instead of Christianity, he embraced the new communist faith and read Marxist pamphlets rather than the Bible. At the age of 20, Stalin was already involved in communist activities. He left the seminary and dedicated his life to revolution. He now entered on an underground life of agitation, propaganda, covert printing presses, and secret meetings. This is all expressive of Stalin's sun in the 12th house, which is the house not only of religious faith, but also underground activity and conspiracy. Stalin's involvement in the Social Democratic Party brought him into conflict with the Tsarist authorities. He was exiled to Siberia several times, but on each occasion escaped and resumed his revolutionary activities. Combining Stalin's sun sign and rising sign, we have the sun in Sagittarius in the 12th house, related to the Capricorn ascendant. As an agent, provocateur, he was exiled and jailed in freezing areas. Stalin had all the brutal commitment of a terrorist. He believed that the ends justified the means, and had no concept of the means determining the end. He incited violent demonstrations and beat up his opponents, and he robbed banks as a source of funds to finance his political activity. The aspect here is Jupiter in Pisces, intercepted in the 2nd house, the house of money and finance. Robs several banks. Before the 1917 revolution, Stalin had been jailed many times by the Tsar's police. This we can see in the opposition to Jupiter by Uranus. The aspect is Jupiter in Pisces intercepted in the 2nd house, opposition Uranus retrograde in Virgo, intercepted in the 8th house with Leo on the cusp. Held prisoner periodically as a youth by the Tsar before the revolution amnesty. After the revolution and the overthrow of the Tsar, Stalin joined Lenin and other leading communists to form the first Soviet government. He showed an aptitude for dealing with troublesome situations and people. This is shown by the sextile between Uranus and Venus. Uranus retrograde intercepted in Virgo in the 8th house, sextile to Venus in Scorpio in the 10th house. Worked for the party as a troubleshooter. The skills Stalin showed in dealing with party matters led to his appointment in 1922 as General Secretary and put him in a position where he could build his power base, especially when Lenin's health failed. In pursuing political ambitions, he was ruthless. He spared no one, not even his friends. He didn't hesitate to have the enemies of Soviet power murdered. He purged the best long-serving officers from the army. Arrested on Stalin's orders were almost all the Tsar's military specialists and placed on a barge in the Volga. This floating prison suddenly sank with most of its prisoners.
The barge must not sink, clean. Be very careful. They'll all be lost. Be very, very careful.
The aspect is Mercury in Sagittarius in the 11th house with Scorpio on the cusp, related to Mars in the 4th house. Hunted out and killed friends and army officers. Stalin's actions earned him the enmity of the Bolshevik Leon Trotsky, who was a close collaborator of Lenin's and Stalin's rival for leadership of the party after Lenin's death. Stalin was always suspicious of Trotsky. They hated each other.
Murder, murder. He says an accident. The officers were being held on a barge, and the barge sank.
And who put them on the barge? Irreplaceable professional officers. And who killed them? Stalin. I demand his immediate recall.
Stalin is a trusted comrade.
Replace him, or I resign. It's Trotsky or Stalin.
Trotsky or Stalin? You don't understand. It must be Trotsky and Stalin. We need you both.
The aspect concerned here is between Mercury, Venus, and Saturn. Jewish political adversary Trotsky. Note that the ski of the name of Trotsky comes under Mercury and Aries. Stalin liked to stay in the shadows. His face was like a sort of mask that concealed what he was really thinking, which was another expression of the sun in the 12th house. The sun is related to Uranus, Mercury, and Vulcan. Skin of face pierced and marked with pits of smallpox and concealed by makeup. Stalin was bitterly aware that he lacked charisma.
Немецкие захватчики хотят иметь истребительную войну с народом СССР. Что же, если немцы хотят иметь истребительную войну, они ее получат.
He spoke with a thick Georgian accent and a lack of fluency. Jupiter in Pisces intercepted in the 2nd house. Not an orator, he speaks to groups of the converted. He was no orator, but Stalin was supreme at the game of politics. He singled out Trotsky, who had the presence and power of oratory that he so lacked, and planned his downfall.
No, it's Trotsky! Lenin's friend! He's my father! I can't believe
No! It's my husband! My husband! No! Don't take him away!
He's the great
What are you doing? Don't take him away! Stop that! Please! Please don't take him
The aspect is Mars in Taurus in the 4th house, in conjunct Vulcan and Mercury in Sagittarius in the 11th house. Murder of Trotsky with blows of ice pick to the head. The woman who was to become Stalin's wife was known to Lenin as party worker Nadezhda Alliluyeva. She accompanied Stalin on his train journeys and acted as his secretary.
This sleeve you taken from the Secretariat, was that your own idea? What did you say? What?
With a civil war on, I said maybe I could be more useful.
Useful. Useful. Bringing tea to Stalin? Or watching him? Reporting on him?
No, helping him.
Oh. So they said Stalin needs help. Stalin needs help from an 18-year-old girl?
To assist you, to take notes.
Who for? Who asked you to watch Stalin? Who? Was it Trotsky? Or Lenin?
If you look at the seventh house, the house of the spouse, you will see Cancer on the cusp. The ruler of Cancer is Neptune, which is retrograde, suggesting that she was probably the most spiritual person in his life. Nadezhda was independent and not afraid to argue with Stalin. She strongly objected to the heartless treatment of their son and the cruel way he dealt with people. Neptune retrograde conjunct Mars, related to Pluto retrograde in Taurus in the fourth house. Spiritual wife protests loudly and unsuccessfully at his terrorism. Stalin's callousness and lack of warmth and attention drove Nadezhda to leave him several times. The aspect here is Vulcan in Sagittarius in the 11th house, in conjunct Mars, conjunct Neptune retrograde in the 4th house, related to Cancer on the cusp of the 7th house, and in opposition to Venus in Scorpio in the 10th house. Wife angrily leaves home again and again for extended periods. Stalin's one aim was to modernize Russia, but the Russian people suffered far more hardship under him than under the Tsar. He seized the agricultural produce of the Ukraine and sold it abroad to buy industrial machinery. The Ukraine went into famine. Millions of people were dying all over the farmland. When his wife was taking a train back to Moscow, the peasants gathered at the stations and cried to her to tell Stalin they were dying. When she got to Moscow, she called on Stalin immediately. He was at a state banquet. He had his generals and friends and important people all around him. He was smoking and drinking heavily, and when she criticized him for doing nothing about the dying peasants, he tried to shut her up. He took his cigarette and stubbed it out on her arm.
The train stopped at a station. On one side there was a freight train. Cars filled with people being deported. Bodies pitched out onto the rails. One station. How many more are there? A woman ran to me, begging me to tell Stalin, the great Stalin, that people were being starved to death. If only the great Stalin knew, then he would save his people. But here, you celebrate the 50th anniversary of the revolution, and Comrade Stalin feeds his friends while his people starve. Is this what the revolution was for? Oh!
The aspect is Pluto retrograde related to Neptune retrograde conjunct Mars in Taurus in the 4th house, in opposition to Venus in Scorpio in the 10th house. Cruelly stubs out a cigarette on his wife's arm. She broke away from him and rushed out. She shot herself dead that night. The 4th house is the house of death, and Mars is the ruler of Scorpio, the sign of suicide. The aspect is Neptune retrograde conjunct Mars in Taurus in the 4th house. Wife shoots herself out of resentment. Under the same aspect, Stalin's son Yakov also made an attempt on his own life.
Mommy!
Get a doctor.
A flesh wound.
A doctor, and get Vasily out!
Taurus is on the cusp of the 5th house of sons and daughters. Driven to despair by his father's coldness to him, he tried to shoot himself, but the bullet passed right through him and he survived. Son fails in suicide bid. Stalin greeted him with a mocking, "Ha! You can't even shoot straight."
Idiot. Can't even shoot straight.
But Stalin had been wrong about his son. Yakov was at the front from the first days of the Second World War. He fought bravely and did his duty to the end, but his unit was surrounded and he was taken prisoner. After resisting torture and collaboration with the Germans, he was shot while escaping. The aspect is Sun in Sagittarius in the 12th house, related to Pluto retrograde in Taurus in the 4th house, related to Venus and Scorpio in the 10th house. Son, an artilleryman in World War II, is taken prisoner and dies while escaping. Stalin felt no responsibility for his family tragedies, but saw them as treachery to himself. Pluto retrograde in Taurus in the 4th house. Cursed his family loudly in resentment. Stalin did, however, love his daughter Svetlana, but she too was appalled at her father's immoral regime. She traveled abroad to talk to the newspapers about his crimes. She is represented in the horoscope by Vulcan, ruler of Taurus, on the cusp of the 5th house of sons and daughters. Vulcan in Sagittarius in the 11th house, with Scorpio on the cusp, related to Mars and Pluto retrograde in Taurus in the 4th house. Daughter goes abroad to expose in the newspapers the domestic violence and crimes against the people. Stalin's private life and working life were one and the same. He lived for one thing, and that was his work. He was a slave to it. Days off did not exist for him. Moon conjunct Saturn in Aries in the 3rd house. Very hard and active worker, or in one word, workaholic. The same aspect made Stalin impose slavery on the many thousands he put behind the barbed wire of the labor camps. Moon conjunct Saturn in Aries in the 3rd house. Introduced slave labor. The cinema was the only incursion Stalin would allow into his working life. It became a habit to watch films in his projection room late into the night. Any film that was being talked about would be screened, but he was most interested in Hitler, who fascinated him. Venus and Scorpio in the 10th house. Chronic film watcher. Stalin was now supreme in Russia. Like Hitler, he had all the powers of a dictator, and he used them to eliminate any hint of opposition. He was paranoid and suspected almost everyone of plotting against him. Sun in Sagittarius in the 12th house. Suspicious of those around him. When the show trials began, they removed any real or imaginary enemies and were an important means of propaganda, convincing the Soviet public that there really were enemies everywhere, even at the highest levels of the party. Show trials is Sun in Sagittarius in the 12th house, related to Libra on the cusp of the 9th house. In the dictionary, paranoia is Venus related to Mercury in Virgo in the 8th house. The equivalent of this in Stalin's chart is Virgo in the 8th house, with the moon, the planet of sickness, in Aries in the 3rd house. And if we include Uranus retrograde, which is in conjunct the moon, his paranoia was a sickness in the extreme. Disagreement with the leader on any issue became a crime. Note that Saturn, the planet of old age and karma, is conjunct the moon, so that the condition worsened with age, but Stalin remained a master of concealment. Jupiter in Pisces intercepted in the 2nd house, opposition Uranus, retrograde in Virgo, intercepted in the 8th house. The paranoia was hidden beneath coarse jokes and eccentricities. If we include Aquarius on the cusp of the 2nd house and Leo on the cusp of the 8th house, we can identify another medical condition: angina from hidden irregularities of heartbeat and blood pressure. With the outbreak of the Second World War, Stalin's policy was to gain valuable time to allow his massive rearmaments program to take place. Russia needed to maintain peace abroad at all costs, and so a non-aggression pact with Hitler was signed. But Hitler too was playing for time, not yet wanting to fight a war on two fronts. Finally, Hitler's forces invaded, inflicting some of the worst atrocities of the war. Half the Red Army was wiped out as the Germans advanced on Moscow. In the ensuing panic, Stalin reacted in a predictable manner. He took to booze. This is a combination of the 2nd, 3rd, and 8th houses. Ultimately, of course, the Soviet Union wins its great victory and destroys Nazi power on the Eastern Front. Venus and Scorpio in the 10th house, semi-sextile Mercury in Sagittarius in the 11th house. Protracted fighting and huge factory production won him World War II. After the war, Stalin's power was greater than ever. Until his death in 1953, he resumed his repressive measures at home and conducted foreign policies which contributed to the Cold War between the Soviet Union and the West. Sun in Sagittarius in the 12th house, related to Mercury, and Vulcan in Sagittarius in the 11th, related to Venus in Scorpio in the 10th. Politically, he drew an iron curtain, full length, dividing Europe in two. A cruel conspiracy. And so, at the end of the show, a curtain is drawn full length across the stage. It is remarkable how the symbols of astrology encapsulate and synthesize the many diverse and sometimes contradictory elements in a life. In the implementing of his soul's purpose, Stalin's great achievement was the industrialization of Russia. But it was progress at the cost of much sorrow and suffering. Both are expressions of Capricorn rising, the industrialization of the nation and unending sorrow and suffering, the sacrifice of the Ukraine peasants to ambition with 3 million dead from famine. The ruler of Capricorn is, of course, Saturn, the planet of long-term karma. And Saturn is in Aries, the sign of the nation, and of relentless power. Stalin was the administrator of Russia's chronic karma. And it was violent karma. He smashed the Tsarist regime and purged the army. He dragged the Second World War out into wintry conditions, and the good karma of Russia, her long winter, defeated the Germans. But he also brought misery and destruction to the Russian people, even to those closest to him. He willfully isolated them behind an iron curtain because he didn't want them to see the success of the West, which was no doubt conspiring against him on the other side of the curtain.